and I want to welcome you to today's session, which is getting started on your DEI journey. So I hope that you're all doing as well as can be expected during these kind of crazy and challenging times. We definitely miss seeing all of you at our Pond House gatherings, and we really look forward to the day when we can all gather again in person. So special thanks, as always, to my trusty NSP teammates, Betsy Johnson and Monica Kelly, for all of their behind the scenes assistance and their great teamwork in planning for and managing the logistics for today's session. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. I'll just repeat myself and say, please take a moment and rename yourself with your first name and your organization name, as I've done. That'll be helpful when we get to the breakout segment of this session today. We will be recording this session today, and we will be placing the recording on our workshop's webpage along with the slides, and we'll be doing that pretty soon, either by this afternoon or tomorrow. And Betsy will be posting the link to that page in the chat. We also ask that you place yourselves on mute to sort of cut down on any background noise, since we've got a pretty big group today. If you have questions during the session, we welcome them. Please put your questions in the chat, and Joelle, our presenter, will try to get to as many of the questions as she can. Betsy will also be posting the survey for this session in the chat toward the end of the session, and you'll also get an email with the survey immediately following the session. So please do fill it out and share your feedback with us. Believe it or not, we do actually read every single survey, and we really value your free feedback and your suggestions on this session, but also on kind of what you need in the future. So I'm delighted that our presenter today is Joelle Murchison, whom some of you may know. Joelle is the founder of Exec Mommy Group, which offers workshops, speaking engagements, training, coaching, and consulting across a variety of sectors, including education, nonprofit, small business, and the corporate world. And as you might imagine, there is a great deal of interest these days in DEI work. And it would be an understatement to say that Joelle has been busy. Things have been more than a little hectic for her, which is, it's a good thing. And Joelle, in fact, has been working with the Hartford Foundation staff to help bring us along on our DEI journey. So we really are all working and learning together. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Joelle.
Thank you so much, Mayor. And it is wonderful to see so many faces online this afternoon, to talk a little bit about DEI and your journey. I have to say, I'm grateful to Mayor and the staff of the Hartford Foundation for being willing to offer this session. Several months ago, I think in a tiny bit of a cry for help, I said to Mayor, there are so many nonprofits who could benefit from this conversation. We are experiencing a resurgence, a new awareness, quite frankly, around racial inequity in this nation. And there are many, many organizations who are looking for assistance in what they do next. There are a number of individuals who are out in the space as consultants who can provide assistance. And then there are also some folks who have really taken advantage of the opportunity and entered into the space and may not necessarily be so helpful. So I thought it would be a good idea to have a session that would help our region's nonprofit organizations to start to do some of this work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so today we will spend a good chunk of time in education, if you will. One of the things that I have come to realize is so critically important is to know what we're talking about. And I'm sure many of you have heard lots of phrases thrown around, particularly over the last several months as we've engaged in this work. So what we'll start out doing is a little bit of education to frame exactly what it is that you indeed, as an organization, are positioned to do. And then once we've done a bit of that, we will talk about what would be necessary for you as an organization to begin to intentionally talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to view the work that you do through that lens. So I'll help or indicate some steps on a journey that I think are really important for you. And then you'll have an opportunity to go into a breakout group. Some of you have multiple individuals from your organizations here, and we will group you together. Others who may be either sole practitioners or the only individual from your organization, we will partner you with some others who are in the same place so that you can learn from one another as you begin the building blocks of starting your own diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. I have seen in the chat that there are some people who have to leave at different points in time. As was stated, this will be recorded, so you certainly can go back to see anything you miss. But also, if you are able, we will, as I mentioned, be engaging in a couple of different breakouts throughout the program. It would be wonderful, if at all possible, if you can keep your camera on, to stay engaged. It's really important as we connect with one another that we don't miss out on the opportunity to effectively partner. So if as much as possible you can stay with your camera on, that would be great. We understand that some of you may be on phone or may be constrained to do so, but please certainly engage as much as you possibly can. So with that, let me go ahead and share my PowerPoint and we can get started. All right, so getting started on your DEI journey. I like this slide aesthetically, but I selected a road for a very relevant reason. This journey that we are beginning, that some of you may have begun within your organizations or at minimum in dialogue, is not an overnight activity. It is indeed a journey that we must prepare for. And as you know, with any road, there are times where there are twists and turns, potentially moments where you can't see ahead. Perhaps, as is demonstrated in this image, the sun could potentially be blinding you. So those of you in the Hartford area, you're familiar with traveling westbound on 84 at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Blinding sunshine. The sun is beautiful, but sometimes it's hard for us to see. And that's what our DEI journey is like. So if you all would prepare, get in your cars and put on your seatbelts, we are getting ready to take our ride. Let's begin by just taking a quick look at a video to help center the challenges that some of us have as we approach this work. Let me just make sure we have all the sound set up. Oops. All right.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Yeah. Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap! Beware, Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip pip! Cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
Yes, my friends, sometimes we wonder where we are all from. And yet the reality is that we make a lot of assumptions as we determine who we're engaging with and how to engage. And so that was just a little bit of a lighthearted way to bring to bear the challenge that we have ahead of us as we begin to talk about diversity in the context of our world, really. So I like this quote to kick us off as we think about what's ahead. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that is James Baldwin, who I think has helped guide us in many, many ways with his infinite wisdom that is still relevant in these times. But yes, the challenge for us is that if we do not begin to explore the conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we cannot actually bring change to bear. And so it is time for us to have these conversations. Today, we have 3 learning objectives. The first, to identify opportunities to leverage your desired outcomes for your organization through a DEI lens, to identify what you need to know in order to do so, and then finally, to identify available resources in order to support your journey. All of these things will be critically important. First, identifying, learning, identifying what needs to be changed, right? Before we can change it. What we might need to know, what are our gaps? What are our blind spots that will help us as we move forward? And then who can help us, right? This is not a journey that we should go on alone. And so what resources are available to us to allow us to move forward? So as we go through the day, our agenda will operate as follows. We're going to do a check-in momentarily, which we will accomplish via chat. And then I will do a bit of an overview around diversity and inclusion, defining some terms, spending some time talking about bias and how it shows up, particularly in the context of our workplace, all things that we might need to, 1, begin to discuss, but also 2, begin to dismantle as we intentionally support this work. Then we will get into an opportunity to really think about how DE&I can be embedded in the context of our work in each of our organizations. And then, as I referenced earlier, you'll have an opportunity to go into breakouts with your team or others to talk about what steps you can take from today to get started. Of course, as Mayor indicated, I'm happy to take questions along the way as I can get to the chat to see what is happening. Also, if you have comments, you can feel free to engage in the chat as well, as there are over 100 of us. And I think the chat is always a wonderful way to engage in dialogue. So please keep that going. All right, so moving forward, we are now going to check in or not. I'm going to tell you about what we're going to think about today. See, this is the challenge of not knowing what slide I have next. So work with me. So there are a couple of questions in addition to the learning objectives that I'm hoping that we'll be able to accomplish. And you saw this when you registered for the session today. Some of the things that we will be exploring, including how do we begin? What do I need to know to begin? What's the current state of our organization as it relates to DEI? How do we navigate difficult conversations? Because in fact, beginning these conversations are often challenging because it means that we have to step outside of our comfort zones and leave the status quo behind. Who should be at the table? Who's not at the table? What perhaps are our blind spots? And then certainly what resources are available to us. In order for us to effectively engage in dialogue today, I'd like for you all to take the opportunity to review the group guidelines that are listed on your screen. I'm not going to read through them all, but I do want to highlight just a few. As I referenced, there are a couple of times that we'll go into breakout rooms. Some of them you will be with folks who you know, and other times you won't. What's critically important as we engage in dialogue, however, is that there is a set of guidelines or guardrails that help us as we move forward. And these are a few that I would like for us to embrace today. I want to illuminate just a couple. One of them being make space, take space. So in many of our organizations, we may be known to be someone who is willing to engage, always has something to share. And that's really important because we need to hear your voices. But I'd like to ask you today, if possible, to make space for some of your colleagues who may not be ones who are likely to be the first to step up. Maybe they like to take a little bit more time to think before they engage. So I'd encourage you to make some space for those folks. And if that is you, that person who's less likely to speak up and share your perspective, I would encourage you to take space. Use today as an opportunity to step outside of your comfort zone and have your voice as a part of our dialogue. We will all be richer for hearing the perspectives and experiences of each of the individuals who take part today. The second that I'd like to illuminate is using I statements. There are many instances, particularly within the nonprofit sector, where we make lots of generalizations about nonprofit organizations. For example, we also tend to make generalizations about people based upon where they live, what their name is, right? And so we think that that's how things operate. So, well, you know how in nonprofit or how, in people who live in this particular state. I'd encourage you today to use I statements. Reflect on your own experiences and share them with us in that manner. Use words like or statements like, I think, what I've seen in my experience, as opposed to, well, this is how things operate, or that's how we've always seen them to proceed. Use I statements. And if there are others who have similar experiences, they too can sign on and say, yes, I've experienced that as well. But it's important that we try as much as possible not to generalize about our collective experiences. And then finally, I'll encourage you to be open to discomfort. One of the critical components of having conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion is that many of us have not had these conversations before, either with our own intimate group of friends or colleagues, or more broadly. And so I would encourage you to be willing to be challenged as you think about some of the terms we'll hear, as you think about the work that your organization is doing, and perhaps those things that maybe you haven't thought about. Be open to the discomfort that comes with that. We know that with growth, oftentimes there is a little bit of pain, but it's worth it at the end of the day. I have an 11-year-old boy, and I can tell you that the growing pains scenario is real, but at the end of the day, there is real benefit from that discomfort. So I've illuminated just a few of them. Hopefully you all can see the remainder on the screen. What I would love to know is, A, are there other guidelines that you would like to add that you think would be helpful for us as we proceed today? If so, please feel free to share in the chat. And secondly, if there are no additional guidelines that you'd like to add, I would love your active engagement and buy-in by giving me a thumbs up, nodding your head yes, and letting me know that you believe that you can accommodate these guidelines this afternoon. Are we all on the same page? Excellent. I'm seeing lots of thumbs up. All right, folks, here we go. So let's check in. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind, particularly as you have these conversations in your organizations, is we must be clear about how we're feeling as we enter this dialogue. And quite frankly, I should note that we are in a very uncertain time, surely in our nation. And I'm certain that that has some impact as to how maybe you came to this session today. So if you would take a moment and just check in, find out from yourself how you're feeling right now. And if you would be willing to share one word in the chat box to let us know how you're feeling right now, just one word as we approach our time. We're hearing hopeful, optimistic, curious, unsettled, hopeful, nervous, thankful, fragmented, sleep deprived, encouraged, gut punched, anxious, exhausted, overwhelmed, happy, encouraged, tired, grateful, patient, open, encouraged, sad, curious, energized, overwhelmed, nervous, anxious, frightened, optimistic, hopeful, tired, exhausted, encouraged, prayerful, frazzled, grateful and mindful, all of the above, hopeful, excited, tired, optimistic. Thank you all so much for sharing your feelings with us in this moment. I would imagine that many of us, as we heard from and this is my new favorite, all of the above, all of the range of emotions that we are experiencing in this time and in this moment. And that backdrop plays out literally in the context of how we then carry ourselves in the context of our work. It's important sometimes, and you should certainly feel free to use this check-in as a moment when you're with your teams, right? Just take a moment to check in and see how folks are feeling as you are about to embark on decision-making in particular. It's helpful to allow you to recenter yourself if you need to, so that you can effectively take in the information or make the decision that you need to make. I see a couple more came in just as I was talking. Excited, weary in the African American sense of the word, unsettled, and tired. So I hear you. I hear you as we go through this, this workshop today. I do hope that the learning and the conversation here gives you some inspiration as we move through in this definitely uncertain and unsettled time. So let's talk a little bit about what is diversity and inclusion. We've probably heard the term or the phrase thrown around many, many times, particularly over the course of the last 6 or 7 months. So what is it? Well, what this slide attempts to share with you is a bit of the history of diversity and inclusion, and where we began as a nation talking about this as it impacts our workplaces, certainly. Compliance. In the 70s, many of you who are on the Zoom will recall the beginning of affirmative action and the intent behind it to create space where there previously had not been access by people of color and women to the workplace. It's considered sort of compliance because it was extremely supported by legal ramifications. In particular, if in fact the organization was not in compliance with affirmative action policies, they could potentially see some consequences. That was really the beginning of conversations around what we know today to be diversity and inclusion. We looked at it strictly from a how can I ensure that I do what I'm legally required to do, which might mean hiring a specific number of individuals who are members of a particular group. We heard people talk about quotas, all initially with the intention of being compliant, right? Ensuring that there were not consequences to your organization or your business. Over time, as we began to understand the value to having different perspectives and individuals from different backgrounds in our organizations, we began to acknowledge that differences in fact occur. And we moved from simply compliance to recognition. That was in the 80s when we started to begin to acknowledge nationally Black History Month, Women's History Month, Asian Awareness Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, Native American History Week, and so on. We began to acknowledge the differences that made up our community, and we celebrated them, oftentimes in very activity-driven ways, and oftentimes for that one moment of the year or of the month that we recognize that difference. Fortunately, over time, there was conversation that helped us to recognize much further than simply acknowledging the differences or celebrating the differences, that there was truly value in embracing and leveraging the differences that individuals bring to the table from a variety of experiences, that there is in fact positive opportunity for organizations to embrace the different perspectives that people bring who come from different backgrounds and experiences. That brought us to inclusion. And so now what do we do with all of the differences that over time we have begun to identify? The last stage, which is represented here, is activation or engagement, which is where we see some organizations really beginning to leverage diversity and inclusion as a part of the fabric of who they are as an organization. It's not a bolt on, it's not a nice to do, but there's a clear recognition that inclusion drives their business or organizational goals. It is a competitive advantage. Now, throughout that whole period of time, there was increasing opportunities to link diversity and inclusion to a business or organization strategy. And we all became much more knowledgeable about different cultures, our cultural worldview expanded. But the opportunity still exists for us to go further. But just wanted to give you a little sense of sort of where we've come from as we've sort of moved along the continuum and matured in relation to our conversations around D&I. So diversity and inclusion, what are they? Well, diversity has been talked about as the mix. All of us here who come to this session or who come to this engagement bring diversity. There are a number of different dimensions of diversity, both those visible and those that are perhaps invisible to us, that allow for our gathering to represent a diversity of different perspectives. Inclusion, on the other hand, is what we do with that. So if you think back to the recruiting example of the 70s, where the thought was to, around affirmative action, we should simply hire, 3 or 4 more women, 5 or 6 more African Americans, 7 more Latinos to ensure that we have a diverse workforce. Well, what quickly became the case is that it's not just about who is there. It's not just about, as we used to say, the heads, but it's about making the heads count. So what's the value of bringing together people from different backgrounds and experiences if you don't, in fact, take full advantage of it? Diversity is also described as representation, who indeed makes up the table. In some ways, we can think about it in the context of ingredients. For those of us who are foodies out there, I like to think about the salad that I make. And it's a very, I love sort of the sweet and savory elements. And I like to have equal sort of representation of all of those things. You've got to have your greens, and I like to have a cheese, blue cheese, and then I like to put cranberries in it. And there's got to be that right balance of whatever protein I'm using. And then the salad dressing sort of brings it all together. And my favorite thing is when I have that perfect bite where I taste all of those different ingredients. They don't lose their identity or their flavors. I can distinctly taste each of them, but the combination of them together makes just that perfect bite. It's kind of how we like to think about what happens when we all come together in the context of our organization. We don't ask anyone to lose their identity or to change it. They should be welcome for who they are. And the expression of what they bring is indeed the gift, not because we can't taste it or because we can't experience it, but because it is indeed there. Very different than what in society for years we talked about this country as a melting pot. But that metaphor suggests that somehow whatever is included in it has lost its form. It's lost its identity. And that's not what inclusion is. Inclusion asks us to allow for the space to invite each of those distinct ingredients in to be who they are, right? And so that's why it's not enough to just say diversity. It's not just about who's there, but it's about how we create access and space for everyone to be who they are in that space. Some will say diversity is an invitation to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance, right? So not just being there, but really being a part of it. There's even some conversation today in this space. We talk about the word belonging, which further than inclusion and being leveraged is really feeling a part of the organization. So if you're going along the party analogy, you're invited to the party, that's diversity. Inclusion is being asked to dance, but belonging means that you get to pick the music that's played. And so you're dancing to the music that you might choose. These are all different ways of describing and defining diversity and inclusion. The rationale for why both make sense in the context of our work, but also in helping to distinguish between the difference between one and the other, and hopefully for some of you, helping to understand why you might have heard both used together at the same time. So let's take this concept just a little deeper. What you see in front of you is an iceberg. And one of the things that probably some of you, I'm confident, are with me back in 7th grade, perhaps in earth science class, you learned about an iceberg. This is certainly one of those random factoid information areas that you still can remember after 30, 40, 50 years. One of the things that we learned about an iceberg is that you can only see a small percentage of it over the surface of the water. Sometimes that's about 10%. What that means is that cruise ships and military vessels have to have very specific and precise instrumentation and tools that allow the captain to navigate around what, based upon their vision, might not be such a big deal. In fact, however, if they did not depend upon those instruments, they could be setting the ship up for imminent danger. Now, think about us as human beings. We often, if you look at this image, make determinations about people based upon what we can see. Sometimes we're able to determine someone's age. Perhaps based upon their skin color, we are able to determine what race or ethnicity they are. Maybe we can determine someone's gender, but we may not even be right. But those are the traits that we tend to be able to see about people, and they are what help to form our opinion and our assumptions about who they are. But think about the other 90%, what we can't see below the surface. Some things like socioeconomic status, our values, where we're from, right? What our parental status is, perhaps our sexual orientation, our marital status, communication style. All of those things and many more make us who we are. But yet, as human beings, we typically default to those things that we think we know based upon what we can see. And as you, I'm sure, are clear, if we were to think about it in the context of an iceberg, we too could be in some danger and have probably caused a bit of damage as a result of our sight not going deeper into understanding who people are. And these are all essentially dimensions of diversity. All of the things that you see here, those both above the line and below the waterline, make up who we are and what we bring to the table each day. So what I'm going to ask you all to do now is to engage in an activity that will ask you to think about the most salient identities that you hold. What I want you to do is, on a piece of paper or on a tablet or the back of an envelope that you might have at home, draw 5 circles. Put your name in the middle of the first circle, right in the center, and then draw 4 circles around. What I want you to do in those 4 circles is to write 4 different, or in each circle, write an identity that is a salient way that you describe yourself. It could be anything. If you, and I'll flip back to this prior screen if it's helpful, it can be any descriptor or any identity that perhaps you believe best defines you. I want you to choose the 4 most salient ones for you. It could be race, gender, it could be a hobby, your profession, your religion, any particular descriptor identity that you choose. The 4 most salient ones for you. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do that on your own, and then we will prepare to go into some pairs. And I'll want you, when you get into those pairs, and Monica, I'll let you know when to press the button to get them going, give them a few minutes to think about their identities on their own. When you get into your pair, I want you all to first introduce yourselves, right? Because you likely will be with someone who you don't know. And then share those identities that you selected. I'll then ask you to answer 2 questions that will show on the screen and will shoot out in the chat for you when you are in your pair. And we'll ask each of you to share. And then we'll come back together and we'll talk a little bit about what it felt like, both to have the experience of selecting the 4 identities, and perhaps the questions that you'll talk about if you are so inclined. So we'll give you about maybe another minute to identify your identities, and then we will send you off into your breakout groups. And these are the questions. They've already actually been shared in the chat. So just to model the way for you, I would write Joelle in the center of the circle. And for me, I would choose Black, educator, mother, and entrepreneur. Those are the 4 most salient identities that I hold today. Welcome back. And I know what you're going to say is we had no time to talk. Our apologies. 1, because there were a couple of groups who had 3 instead of 2. So I am confident that you did not have the opportunity to engage fully. And then you have to be careful what you ask for. When you say that you need help and you say that, oh yeah, 5 minutes is fine. And then your wonderful helper does 5 minutes, literally. And really, you guys probably needed like 7. So it's all good. We're back together now in a great big family. So I hope that at least some of you had the opportunity to at least begin the dialogue. You probably didn't get into the questions, but at least you had an opportunity to share with each other what the 4 identities were, perhaps that you came up with. So I'm curious, at minimum in that conversation, were there some of you for whom that selection was challenging? Was it hard to come up with 4 identities, or did you have any trouble? Is there anyone who would like to unmute or raise your hand and let us know if you want to weigh in? You can either raise your hand. Someone I hear in the chat, it was hard. Absolutely, it was hard. So let's talk about that. Is there someone who would want to share with us? Why was it so hard to choose?
I'll say that for me, it was hard to limit it to 4.
Okay, yeah, talk about that, Pat. Tell us why. Why was it hard to limit?
Because I do a bunch of various things like teaching and being an administrator and being a social worker and writing and so forth. So it was hard to narrow them down or group them in a way that there'd be only 4.
Hard to narrow them down because perhaps you had to leave something out, right? Didn't really give a full representation of who you were. Anybody else? Hard to come up with 4? Hard to get to 4? Anybody, was it difficult to even get to 4?
Hi, Kiara with Connecticut. I thought it was a little difficult to get to 4 personally, just because as one of the younger people in the group, you feel like, okay, well, what have I done so far, or what are the things that shape who I am? And choosing 4 was a little difficult because, okay, yes, I'm an educator, or yes, I'm Black, but now what else?
Right. So who am I, right? And what do you choose, right? For how many of you, and that was, thank you, Kiara, for speaking to what it would be like not to be able to even get to 4. So as you thought about the 4 that you chose, is there anyone who thought, well, gosh, if I have to share this with someone in this group, I'll use these 4. I'm not going to use these other ones. Did anybody have that kind of existential conversation in their mind, which 4 I'm choosing because I'm in this group and I may have to share it? Anybody? No? Oh, I see people shaking their heads. No, yes. I see Donna. Would you like to chime in? I saw that very deliberate yes. Unmute and share with us.
I didn't say I wanted to unmute, but yes, depending on which group you're in, you usually will identify accordingly. I put African-American, mother, educated, urban, because I'm from Bridgeport, Connecticut, and I think it plays a lot of who I am. So I did that. I think if I'm in another situation, I may not necessarily say urban or certain identifiers.
Right, absolutely, right. So, and I see some stuff coming in the chat too. Folks are saying, yep, I did that in my head without realizing it. Was very aware that being white was not one that I think of as a central way I describe myself, even though I know what a significant part of me that is. That's real, that's real. Balance of personal and professional. Yes, I'm not even sure I wanted to share that I'm a perfectionist. It's not always a good thing. We're mindful of our audience, absolutely. So these are things that we are thinking about actively, right? When we have the opportunity to make some decisions about who we are, right? But think about those folks in our society who don't get a chance to self-decide what those identities are that they are then, sort of judged upon, right? All the time, we look at people and we put them into categories based upon what we see. This opportunity gave you a chance to think about, well, who am I, right? And what am I choosing to share within this context? But think about the notion that in our society, oftentimes we don't get that opportunity to share who we want people to see us as, right? If you all had gotten the opportunity to talk through the questions that we shared, and again, my apologies for getting you back so quickly. The questions were, and I don't know if any of you got to them, but the questions were, share a time where you were particularly proud to be one of the identities that you chose. And then on the flip side, share a time where you might have been particularly, where it was particularly hurtful to identify.
Unmute. Now it's got mute.
I'm sorry?
See, now they can hear you.
Oh, did you want to say something?
Okay, see, she can hear us. Now I got to unmute myself again.
Now you know how to unmute. Okay. So when we think about that, right, sometimes there are those that we're proud of, right? We heard someone in the chat say they weren't sure they wanted to divulge a particular identity because maybe they're a little, maybe it's not a good thing, right? Did anyone get to those questions and were able to think about an identity that you shared that made you feel particularly proud, or perhaps one that might have been a bit hurtful to recognize that you are? Oh, someone said they didn't have the question, so they may not have translated over into the chat once they went. So someone says, very proud to be a Vermonter. All right, awesome. What else are we proud about of the identities that you selected? What in particular might you share that you were proud about one of the ones you shared? Anyone can either chat.
Happy Friday, Joelle. This is Armando at Covenant Prep.
Armando, good to see you.
You as well. Good to see everyone on here smiling, during these times of uncertainty. Great to see a lot of glow and smiles on these faces. Thank you for putting this on. One thing, so I listed what I call the intangibles, or things people can't notice. So mine were leader, giver, supporter, but also naive, right? I've owned the fact that I am naive to a lot of stuff. It's still a lot of learning. When I spoke with Eric, who was absolutely great, and we had a good conversation, but I was afraid to share naive because naive has a negative connotation. But through me understanding and reflecting that me being naive, that means that there's room and opportunity for me to learn how to diminish me being naive, but also me opening to understand, me being open and willing to understand that, compassion, sympathy, empathy, especially in my role now, but even just people I engage with in the way our nation is now in our world. Being naive, I've learned to not take it as a negative, but more as an opportunity for continue to grow. So I was hesitant at first, but having a great conversation with Eric, kind of provided me some confidence to understand that, he reassured me that that's great that you're willing to, take that step to want to learn and become better.
And I appreciate your approach to the exercise in the context of thinking about those things that would be less likely to be those things, right, that folks might assume that you would share. And so that's a different depth to the dimensions of diversity that we all experience. I'm just looking at the chat. We see folks who are proud to be a mother. We have military spouses who are proud and found that in that commonality, proud to be a sister, to be a nurse. Someone shared, I'm particularly embarrassed to be a white American in light of this election, although I'm beginning to feel a little better about it. That's real, and thank you for sharing. Being kind and leading with compassion always. Proud to be an LGBTQ mom. Proud of being an immigrant. Proud to be a new mom. Sharing that they have a hidden disability. Something that folks may not see, right? And that so there's some vulnerability in sharing that with others, absolutely. Proud, or sometimes not, perhaps, to be a lawyer, depending on the circumstances. Awesome, this is great. There's someone else who's proud to be a lawyer too, because yes, you worked hard to get through law school, absolutely. The military spouse was connected to being judged, and then the painful moment, sometimes as we determine what those identities that people hold mean, right? Proud to be a Catholic, even in the face of criticism of the church. Proud to be an animal lover. So thank you all for sharing those things. Many of those things, as was evidenced by military spouse, the things that also that we're proud of sometimes are the things that can be most painful for us. We oftentimes hear, as some folks have expressed, owning and the pride in your race or ethnicity in some instances can bring forth significant pain. We've experienced that certainly as we have navigated this country over the last 6 months in particular. And so the notion of identity, or who we are, how we define ourselves, and what that brings to our conversation is a really, really important piece of us beginning this DEI journey. Because you see, as you think about the work that's ahead for your organization, you must begin with you. Who are you? And what do you bring to this conversation? What perhaps about you frames or shapes how you view DE&I, shapes how you view your organization, your board, your staff, your clients or customers, or the individuals that you serve in the context of the work that you do? Our identity is critically important as we think about who we are, but also the opportunities that we have and that are afforded to us in this society. So as we move forward in our conversation, let's now begin to think about, with the context of our identities in our back pocket, let's now think about equity and the notion of what that means in the context of this work. So we've now begun to uncover who we are, thinking about our identities and how they play out, and perhaps the decisions that we make as we put people into buckets based upon what we think we know and what we perhaps have decided the role that people play within our organizations and within our lives. Now let's think about equity and how that plays into this mix. So what you see in front of you is an image that probably many of you have seen before. It's been used over the last couple of years to demonstrate the difference between our calls for equality versus the notion of equity. And so what you see here ultimately is 3 individuals who are viewing a baseball game. I know we have some real baseball fans on this. I was surprised not to hear someone being proud to be a certain fan. I will not out them on this call. But there are 3 individuals who are watching a baseball game. In the first image, everyone has the same box that they can stand on to watch the game. And what that means is that for one of the individuals in particular, they're not able to see the game. In the second box, what you see is that somehow there must have been a conversation that transpired that said, listen, I can't see on this one box, and it doesn't really appear that you need the box. So perhaps can I use the box? And so somehow the individual who in the first box couldn't see can now see. But as you can imagine, it's probably not that comfortable to watch an entire baseball game trying to balance on a box, both for the person who's on the one box and for the person who's on two. I'd have to imagine it would be a little bit nerve-wracking, perhaps, to have to navigate balance and enjoying the game. Those folks in that second box are being treated equitably, in the sense that each has what they might need in order to be able to see, as opposed to just assuming that everyone needs the same thing. The third box, some even define as liberation, meaning someone gave some thought to the fact that probably anyone standing on a box or two boxes wouldn't be very comfortable or wouldn't be sustainable throughout an entire game. So why don't we just put up a fence? That way, if by using this chain link fence, you can see through the fence, unlike the previous fence where you couldn't see. And now the systemic barrier has been removed, which in this case was the wooden fence. And all can actually see the game in the way that works best for them. When we think about our society, we too began in the place on our journey where there was a cry for equality. And we still hear oftentimes many groups asking simply to be treated equally. When in reality, what we'd like to see is not that everyone is treated the same, but that folks are treated or responded to in the way that they need, in a way that is more equitable. When we think about the confluence of diversity and inclusion and equity, it's an acknowledgement not just of who you are and what you bring, but ensuring that you have universal access to be the best you that you can be in the context of that space. That ultimately, my friends, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we strive for in the context of our organizations is that we are able to invite in individuals from whatever background or experiences they may be to share the gifts that they have been given in the way that they best can towards the best outcomes for your organization. Now, many of us have operated for a very long time in the space of equality. We just give everyone the same thing, it should be fine. But we have to ask ourselves if in doing that, we are not fully receiving the full gifts that each of us have to bring to the table, are we truly then bringing forth the best outcomes for our organization? And that is the challenge for us as we think about the work ahead. Because ultimately, who we are as human beings causes us to make a lot of assumptions. And what happens in our brains is what technically takes over when we have choices to make. We also all practice similarity bias, which means that we like to be around people who are like us. It is a deep human capability. We just like to be around people who are like us. It may be like us based upon race or ethnicity, perhaps gender. It could be like us based upon our geographic background, where we're from. Whatever it is, it causes us to exercise that bias, to have people around us who are like us, and then because of the assumptions we make, to potentially keep out those people who are not. So as a result, this is how it can play out within the context of our workplace. We can stereotype those folks who aren't like us, perhaps discriminate against them, even ignore them, ignore their ideas, not invite them to the table. We might deny them an opportunity, Perhaps we're hiring and we can't quite understand why someone would have chosen the career path that they did. So we deny them an opportunity to work within our organization, or maybe they're just not like us. We can hurt people. In fact, at the end of the day, as we know from our bias acts that are carried out, but also from what we do when we ignore and we deny people, we can hurt them. Most importantly, I think for the context of us, is we miss out. We miss out on the richness of what individuals who are different from us, who may not be like us, bring to the table. And that causes, in the context of our work, for us to bring to bear implicit bias. Implicit bias are those attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, in particular, our decision-making, in an unconscious manner. You see, all of these things are working and operating in our brain without us even knowing, because of the assumptions we've made, because of who we've been exposed to or who we've not been exposed to, because of that diversity iceberg and those things that we see and the assumptions that we make based upon the things that perhaps are not visible to us. Those biases show up in the context of our decision making. And that certainly impacts the decisions that are made on behalf of our organizations. So let's explore implicit bias just for a quick moment. A couple of characteristics. Implicit biases are pervasive, which means that all of us have them. Even individuals like judges who take an oath to be impartial, they too still have bias. In fact, if you think about the law enforcement system in general, it's predicated around what they've seen happen before. Precedent, right? That's how judges make decisions. That's how our law enforcement officers determine whether or not someone perhaps is potentially committing a crime or not, right? So we have to recognize that, in fact, all of us have biases. The implicit and explicit biases are related, but they are also not necessarily distinct, meaning you might have an implicit bias in your head that sort of comes out to play when you're making decisions, but it's not something that you outwardly carry out. So you wouldn't necessarily, perhaps, if you have a bias against someone who's a member of a particular religious group, let's just say, you're not going to necessarily wear a shirt that demonstrates that you are against that particular group. But that bias may still exist in your mind. One of the things I think is really interesting about implicit bias is that it doesn't always align with our declared beliefs. So for example, think about most of the world religions, whether it's Catholicism, or it's Christianity, Judaism, Hindu, Buddhism, you name it. They all have some tenet that suggests that we should love our neighbors as ourselves, that we should treat individuals the way we want to be treated, right? But yet, have we not been aware of groups in our nation who have decided that some are superior to others based upon religious doctrine? So those things don't always line up. We might, in fact, be very devout in our beliefs and express that we love everyone, but we don't always carry that out, right? Our biases don't always align. We also tend to have bias that favors our own in-group, meaning that you're biased against people who aren't like you. But guess what? We also have biases within our in-group. How many of you remember a family member or a parent saying, well, you know how we are. You know how fill in the blank folks are, talking about your own group. You know how us Black folk are, or you know how us Italians are, right? You've heard your family members say that. And that sometimes means that you've got biases, sometimes positive, but sometimes negative about even groups that you belong to. The good news story here is that biases are malleable. That means we can change them. What does it take to change them? It takes our awareness and our acknowledgement that they exist, And the ability to unlearn, literally begin to dismantle those thoughts in our minds in order to be able to effectively move forward and make decisions. We can create the change. Because at the end of the day, if in fact we do not dismantle bias in our decision making, it can change the course of one of our clients or our colleagues' life. Think about when you might deny someone based upon a bias because of how you may have felt about someone who looked like that person or what you think those individuals are, right? That could change the course of someone's life. And you have the ability to change it in your mind. So now to make you all feel just a little bit better, you can always blame it on someone, right? We love to do that in our society. And so you can blame your parents and the media for the biases that we have. They're the things that we've been taught over time, and that based upon, in some instances, a lack of exposure to or information to the contrary, we believe it, right? These are things that other people have largely taught us. We have to be careful too, because we can perpetuate them. Because at the end of the day, bias is informed, so we're educated, it's provided to us, and enforced by the environment that you're in. So the people that you've spent time around, right, who, because we are similarity bias, are like us, have helped inform your biases, but the people you spend time around now can help to enforce them, right? So how do you begin to stand up and say, that is not true because I've experienced, or I'm going to actively take steps to unlearn the biases that are perpetuated around us? How can we begin to combat this bias? There's a couple of things. First, awareness, right? There's learning, an opportunity for you to begin a process of education to help you de-bias your brain, if you will, about people or groups or things that you perhaps believe. There's all kinds of opportunities, speakers and books and podcasts and all kinds of things that can help you to learn about those things that you perhaps either don't know or have been biased about. Two things, however, really show up in the context of our work. And the first is allowing sufficient time for decision making. Why is that important? When we are in opportunities, particularly around leadership, we oftentimes have to make decisions quickly. When we make decisions quickly, or when we're under stress, we tend to default to the status quo. And so that doesn't allow us ultimately to acknowledge the fact that the biases that we have could possibly show up and prevent the right decision from being made. So making sure that you leave enough time to make decisions, or to ensure that you're not making significant decisions while under stress, should allow you to begin to make a full decision without the bias emerging. Additionally, we have to think about cultural differences as they play out. How many of you have even said to yourself or ever heard a colleague say, well, I mean, you would think that someone would, right? Anything that you start with a sentence, well, you would think, right, is based upon our assumptions or our bias about how people should behave, right? So if, for example, you are in a meeting and perhaps your colleague is not giving you direct eye contact, in very American Western civilization perspectives, we might think that that person is disinterested, perhaps even someone that you might not be able to trust because they're not looking you directly in the eye. But in fact, did you know that in some cultures around the world, that looking someone who is their superior directly in the eye is considered disrespectful? So do we know enough about the cultures from which individuals that we're engaging with are coming from? That those cultural norms and values that we hold are not universal. They're simply the ones that we hold. And it's important for us to acknowledge that before we jump to conclusions about people's behavior based upon our assumptions, that we think about the fact that there are indeed other ways to approach the things that to us seem so second nature. So just a couple of tips in terms of how to combat bias. So I want you to think about, as we begin to transition into the path on the DEI journey, what one bias might be that you have about the staff of your organization. You don't have to say this out loud, because certainly there are those of you who may be with colleagues amongst your organization. What's one bias that you might have? Do you think perhaps that, as Armando brought to bear, do you assume that because some of the staff might be younger, that perhaps they're naive? Is that something that might pop into your mind when you consider who to ask to complete a task? And then what's one bias that you might have about the clients you serve? In nonprofit, we all provide services to a tremendous amount of individuals in our organizations who need us for a variety of things to help them to realize who they might be, right? In a variety of different ways. But is there a bias that you have about your clients, perhaps? How might that stand in the way of you getting your work done? And so this brings us to this path to a DEI journey for our organizations. You've now had an opportunity to explore your identity. You've had a moment to think about the biases that may show up, and in fact, how they may play out and how you carry out your work. None of those things intentionally or consciously. But now you got to think about, what am I bringing to the table, to the workplace? What biases am I bringing? What old tapes am I bringing that play out in how we carry out our work today? And how perhaps might they, in fact, create barriers for us doing our best work, but also barriers for particular groups who depend upon the services that your organizations provide? So this journey ultimately is a set of policies, practices, and realities that are used to ensure that there is an equitable environment, both for your staff and for the individuals that you serve. That's ultimately where you are going. That is your journey. There are a couple of steps that I would argue for on this journey that will take you to where you need to be. I cannot tell you there is a prescribed amount of time that is required for this journey, because you may spend more time in one step than another. Some of you may be already along the path. And so I'm going to take us through the journey from the very beginning so that you can get some context around what you need as you prepare. And you may clue in at one point or another based upon where your organization is. Once I do an overview of the steps on the journey, then we'll give you an opportunity to go into your groups and really begin to identify for your organization, where are we on this journey? And what do we need in order to move on to our next step? So first, let's look at awareness. Awareness really begins with identifying your challenge, your opportunity. In fact, even articulating that you're ready to begin the journey. It's a look in the mirror. Some of what we just engaged in the earlier part of today's session, the self-discovery. Who am I? What do I know about this thing called diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how, in fact, am I able to leverage what I know to help our organization develop our capabilities to begin this journey? It manifests itself in the form of education. Most of the individuals or the clients that I work with, the organizations that I partner with in this DEI strategic work, need to begin education in order to create a common language, a baseline of understanding for your staff or your board. We have all come to this journey from different places, and yet what we've learned to date may not be the same. And so it's important for your organization to level set. What do we need to know? What is important for us collectively as a staff and board to know as we start on this journey? And so the opportunity to engage folks, to lead you in workshops, perhaps to use some materials that are available. Engage in dialogues within your team to get a sense of who's here, right? Who are the people that are at this table and what do they bring to bear and what have their experiences been with the organization? There are a multitude of resources, particularly nowadays, related to race and equity and inclusion and diversity, sexual orientation, gender, all available to you literally at your fingertips via podcasts, TED Talks, all kinds of things that are available and accessible to you in order to begin your education and continue your own discovery. The notion of a common language. So as an organization, are you clear when you say we're beginning a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey? Do you know what that means? Does it mean the same thing to everyone? For many years, some of us would look at diversity and automatically assume race, perhaps gender. And maybe many of us, staff or board, maybe because of that, maybe we don't have necessarily a positive perspective on what this journey can mean. Maybe for some reason we think it doesn't include us, but it does, because each and every one of us have a role to play as it relates to creating an environment that is inclusive. So how do we develop a common language, understanding what we're talking about, and develop a commitment statement for the organization? What, in fact, are we committed to do on this journey of discovery around diversity, equity, and inclusion? How does this play out in our organization? And what will you commit to do so that your stakeholders and your audiences and your clients fully understand what the goal is, and your staff? Let me add there. So here's just one example. I just pulled a screenshot from an organization called Americans for the Arts. They put forth their statement on cultural equity. To support a full creative life for all, Americans for the Arts commits to championing policies and practices of cultural equity that empower a just, inclusive, and equitable nation. Now, some of you might say, okay, so what does all of that mean, right? There's lots of wonderful, lofty words, but now, right, from your commitment statement, you then drill down, and that becomes the basis of your plan. So here's what we aspire to do, right? It's almost like a vision. And how we will do that is what we develop in the next step. Inquiry. You all have likely heard a lot about diversity and inclusion or racial equity assessments. There are a myriad of tools out there that a number of organizations, I've just screenshotted Race Forward. They do a really good job with their racial equity impact assessment. It is available to you on their website. But there are a number of different tools that are available to you that can assist you in beginning to do the due diligence necessary to determine where your organization is. What do you know about the organization's previous commitments to DE&I in any shape or form? What are the demographics of your staff, your clients, your board? How have you, for example, attracted talent as you look at the makeup of your staff and perhaps looking to see where there might be opportunities around inclusion there? How have you previously attracted talent? What sources have you used? Have you cast a wide net in terms of who you attract, or do you depend upon the referrals of your staff or your board or your next door neighbor, right? How do people get engaged and involved in your organization? How do you attract volunteers? When's the last time you collected any feedback about this? Do you have any idea if, in fact, you are meeting the needs of the diverse set of clients that you perhaps attract? What's your opportunity to look at near peer organizations or organizations who you admire or aspire to be? What are they doing in this space? What can you learn from them? What materials do you put out? And are they representative of the many voices that you serve? Perhaps you can conduct a survey, hold some focus groups, individual interviews. You need to collect all the information you can. Ask lots of questions so that you can begin to understand where you are as an organization. What do you know? What are you good at? What perhaps are your opportunities? And how might you gather all of that information? Step 3 is the beginning of building your plan. You've done some work in self-discovery and education. Everyone is speaking a common language, so they're clear as to what you're doing and what your commitment is. You've done the due diligence to explore who you are as an organization and discovered all the data and feedback that you need to help you. And now it's time to plan. Identify a core team or individual who will be responsible. It's critically important that accountability plays a significant role in your work around DEI. Because simply if you say you're going to do it and you don't do it, there's the possibility that you lose the trust of your stakeholders or staff members who were encouraged by the fact that perhaps in June you stepped out there and made a statement against racism, and yet you still haven't done anything, right? So you have to make sure that there's some accountability in the process. Identify either a core team, which should have some individuals who have decision-making authority, or individual who'll be responsible. I have seen in some organizations put together a core team that has not only staff, but also board members in terms of partnering together to support the work. Leverage the outcomes of the inquiry that you just did. So you spend a lot of time in step 2 digging and finding information and uncovering. So now it's time to leverage those outcomes. What were some of the gaps that you uncovered in that inquiry work? What are some opportunities? What are some areas of strength, whether they be staff members you have or programs? How can you begin to leverage those as you develop the plan and identify your way forward? And then formalize it. Clearly articulate as you take your commitment statement and drill down, what are the 3 or 4 high-level goals that you want to accomplish? Maybe they're connected to board. Maybe you break them down based on stakeholders. Maybe it's you have a goal within your board to increase the representation on your board. Perhaps within staff, you want to provide additional education and workshops to help staff better understand the clients you serve. Perhaps there's one around programming that you seek to find ways to create messages around equity in your programming, right? So whatever the magic number is for you, realistically, right, in a way that you can identify, develop and articulate clear goals that come out of your plan. And then it's time for action. Once you've identified each of the goals that have come likely out of the gaps you identified in step 2, you'll want to begin to take deliberate action. Ensure that you assign accountability individuals who are accountable for each step of the way, that you move with intention, but one step at a time. You know, as I say to people all the time, we did not become this nation that we are overnight. And so the challenges that we have in sort of combating the status quo will also not be dismantled overnight. So it's important for us to be deliberate about the goals that we set and take steps to help us get to our desired outcome. Executing with accuracy. Part of this is around really setting really smart goals, ensuring that the goals that you set are ones that you actually can accomplish and that you have the right people and resources in place to get it done. And then building your outcomes into the performance expectations of your staff or your board, if you have a board measurement mechanism. You know, if we really want to do this work, it's gotta be embedded into the fabric of the organization. And so we've got to have just as high expectations around the execution and the successful accomplishment of this work as we do for those standard metrics that we might hold in our organization. Very, very critical. So now it's your opportunity. You all are going to spend about the next maybe 18 minutes, depending on how fast we get you in. It's supposed to be 20. The next 20 minutes or so answering the following 4 questions. As I mentioned, many of you are here with members of your organization. So you all will be in groups together. For those of you who joined after our initial announcement, if you have not renamed yourself on Zoom to your first name and your organization's name, please take a moment to do that now. as we will be putting individuals who are in cohorts together with their organization. And if you're not with others from your organization, we will be combining you with others. So you can walk through these questions in tandem. Where is my organization on this journey? Where do we desire to be? What resources or information do we need to begin or continue? And then finally, what is standing in our way? So I'm going to stop talking. These questions are going to be made available to you either via broadcast once you get into the breakouts, or chat, or if someone is really industrious. I see some people writing old school. Some people probably already wrote it down. Those of you with a phone, take a picture of it so you have the screenshot for your group. I know you all are very talented, so that you can get started right away. This is your opportunity to start this conversation. Today will not be the end. And I will pop around into each of the groups just to observe. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them for you at that time. Okay, so Monica, you can work your magic and get folks into their breakouts. First of all, let me thank you all for navigating through with such grace and patience the Zoom Breakout Challenge. I feel like it's like a game show now, the Zoom Breakout Challenge. Many of you might have been separated from folks within your organizations. We apologize. We don't know why Zoom wants not to keep you together, but I do hope that those of you who were not with your organization did have really robust conversations, because I think many of you are in a similar position and have a great deal to learn from one another. I'm really encouraged by just a couple of conversations that I was able to hear, and I hope that this has been really helpful. Just a couple of things that I want to make sure that we do before we wrap up. First, hopefully the questions and the path was helpful for you. What I would encourage you to do, I know that the foundation will send out both the slides and the recording early next week, is take those questions and in a next staff meeting, perhaps, ask your team those same questions. In a next board meeting, perhaps, ask your team those same questions so that you all can begin to think about what you might want to do as it relates to your next steps. Excuse me. Let me just pop back to our PowerPoint. So again, you'll have these questions and you'll be able to continue if you didn't have a chance to get through them or to share with others from your organization. So before we go, there are a couple of things that I always want to make sure that folks have, and one of them is an action plan. So you spent some time with your teams and you might have some ideas for what you're going to do next. One of the things that I found to be really helpful for you, and I want you to do this now, is to, based upon your experience today, think about one thing that you can do right now to begin the steps towards either moving along your journey or taking the deliberate steps for your organization to begin conversations around a journey. So one thing that you can do right now. If you're so inclined, feel free to share it in the chat. If you have an absolute tangible thing and you'd like to raise your hand and answer, we're happy to hear your voice as well. There may be others who want to do that same thing. So really intentionally think about what action can you take beginning now in terms of moving your organization. Is there anyone that might want to share or just reflect based upon the breakout time? I can't see all of you. So if you want to raise your hand or if you simply want to unmute, please feel free to do so. If you want to share in the chat, you can do that as well. Let me take a look in there.
I'm just going to chime in and say our organization just formulated a DEI committee, and I've been leading it on behalf of the organization with members who volunteered, and this is helping to really, it's been floundery, and this is really helping me to be able to bring more focus to that conversation and that committee work. So great. This is been so helpful in terms of focus and organization.
Excellent, excellent, that's great. And I see Donna said, as I asked those questions, so absolutely take those back to your teams and ask those questions. That's awesome. a very important step. And I see another comment, our directors need to get to know each other better in order to determine where we are, where we hope to go, and how best to work together. Absolutely. Your board, your leadership team, the self-discovery, I'm sure some of you thought like, oh, you know, who wants to do these activities? It's so critically important to know who you are as you come to this. We make so many assumptions about one another based upon the limited information, right? That 10% that we know about each other. So to be able to really do the deep dive to understand who you are and what your motivation is within your organization is really critical. Awesome. Another group just finished their strategic plan, but now revisit and add in, yes, not as an add-on, embed DE&I throughout. So take a look at the strategic plan and really think about how DE&I will integrate into each of those components. Absolutely. Sharing it with board committee, the governance chairs participated today, so that's awesome. What else? Homework for our board members to review the webinar. Excellent. Thank you so much, Christine, for your comments. So that's your one. So you're hearing what other folks are doing. So for those of you who don't know yet what you might like to do, then there's some examples. And then as a team, particularly for those of you who are together with an intact team, think about what you can do next collectively to advance your journey. So, you know, particularly some of you, and some of you have already shared this, if you came and there are 2 of you and you want to then go back, what will be your game plan, right? When is your next board meeting? When is your next staff meeting? How can you make plans to share the information going forward? So definitely take the time. I know it is Friday and we all want to check out because the sun is actually shining in the greater Hartford area and we need to enjoy this while we can with a mask on. But I definitely think, you know, if you set your plan before you leave your desk area today to enjoy the sunshine, it'll be an important step for you. So this is just a video that I like to close with to give you just some context around what we are facing. This caterpillar and the snail are sort of dealing with a similar challenge, and they ultimately together figure it out, even though they are from 2 different places. So I'm going to share this video with you. There is a link to the NSP website where the handout is. The survey is also in the chat, so please make sure you answer the survey link, grab it and stick it in your screen now so that you won't forget to complete it. And with that, it is the caterpillar and the snail. I am so honored to have had the chance to share with all of you today. And I hope that you have really great journeys on this DEI journey. I promise you it's worth it.
In a garden, there's a caterpillar and a
best friends. They hang out 24/7. They do dinner, movie nights, crafts. Oh, and they're like really into cosplay on top of like whatever else caterpillars and snails do, like eat leaves or something. Anyways, one day they're on their way to a party that's right outside the garden and they have to go through the fence to get there. So the caterpillar goes right through, but the snail is stuck. Her shell is just too big and it won't fit under the wire. So she's like, crap, I can't get through. Maybe like, can you lift up the wire, or maybe we can build a little bridge or something? And the caterpillar's like, dude, just go under. But she can't. There's just no way that the shell is gonna fit. And the caterpillar's like, go under, come on, we're gonna be late and I'm trying to hook up with that super cute ladybug. But it's not happening. The shell will not fit under the wire. And at this point, Snail's getting kind of frustrated because it's not like she doesn't want to go to the party, but for some reason, Caterpillar just isn't getting it. Yeah, it's not that easy for me. I just can't crawl under the fence like you can, so I would really appreciate your help here. Maybe we can like go a different way, and this just like sets the caterpillar off. What the heck? Just because I can crawl under stuff doesn't mean that I have it easy. Do you even know what it's like to have 16 feet? You don't, because finding shoes is a complete nightmare. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm not saying you have it easy. I'm just saying I can't go under the fence because of my shell. That's it. I have a shell and you don't. And there's some stuff that's easier for you that's harder for me. Just like I don't know jack about finding shoes because I don't have feet. Caterpillar thinks about this for a second and realizes the snail is right. I mean, he's never had to think about shells or slimy trails, and that's a privilege that the snail has never had because she has to think about that stuff all the time. That's part of being a snail. And it's kind of like that for everyone, right? I mean, we all have our own struggles and challenges, and some of them are small and some of them are huge and really unfair and beyond our control. And a lot of the time, it can be hard to see what someone else deals with because you've never been in their shoes or shell. Like maybe you're gay or trans, have a disability or different religion, or of course the obvious one, you're a member of a different race. I don't know what it's like to be you, and you don't know what it's like to be me. So it's really important to stop and try and see the other side so we can help each other overcome those obstacles together. It's like sometimes you're the snail and sometimes you're the caterpillar. Oh yeah, okay, so then the snail and the caterpillar figured out that if they went to the other side of the garden, they could get through a little break in the fence. And while it took a little longer to get to the party, they did the trip together, which is what made it so great. So they got to the party, the caterpillar hooked up with the ladybug, snail taught everyone how to do the wobble, and the party was everything. The end. This video was illustrated by the very talented.
So if a caterpillar and snail can do it, so can you. Find a way through for everyone to get through, and you will be on your journey. Thank you all for your time today. Really appreciate the energy and flexibility, and please be sure to complete the survey for today's session. Thank you. Mayor?
Really not much to add. Thanks everyone for being here with us. There is a question in the survey about what else you need to continue progressing on your DEI journey. So if you could share that with us as well, it'll help us think about what more we could offer to all of you. So again, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy your weekends, and thank you, Joelle, as well for leading us through this today.
Have a great afternoon.